Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for coming. I am honored as a Vietnam veteran that the Morris J. Taylor Post 136 of the American Legion has asked me to speak on this evening, a most bittersweet holiday. All across America, on village greens and on the steps of village halls, just like this, Americans observe Memorial Day. However, I believe it's important before we enjoy the lights of summer with family and friends to first be uncomfortable, if only just for a moment. Uncomfortable at the loss we know, excuse me, others have suffered and still suffer by the loss of a loved one in the service of our country. Memorial Day signals not just the first weekend of the summer season, it's a time to remember those who have made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. All of us who have served our country in time of war were placed in harm's way, always with the hope and the dream that our own prayers, as well as those of our loved ones at home, would be answered, and we would return home safely. Not all of us who served in harm's way were lucky enough to have had those prayers answered. It is those unanswered prayers, those unfulfilled dreams for the future that make me uncomfortable. We have been fortunate in our country to have spent nearly 3 decades in relative peace between the end of the Vietnam War and September 11, 2001. Sure, there have been conflagrations and confrontations in Grenada, Panama, Haiti, Somalia, Bosnia, and of course, Desert Storm, but the loss of American life had been minimal compared to what it had been during the first 3 quarters of the 20th century prior to the end of that Vietnam War. From the very beginning of our country, from Bunker Hill to Gettysburg and on to San Juan Hill, from the Argonne Forest to the Battle of the Bulge, from Normandy to Iwo Jima and on to the Battle of Midway, from Hue to Sadr City, from the Korean DMZ to the Cambodian border, then on to Kandahar, and now on to Aleppo. Many families have been touched, not only by the service of their sons and daughters in faraway places, in dangerous places, but by their loss, with their prayers being unanswered, with those sons and daughters not returning home. This year's Memorial Day is especially meaningful for me, as 50 years ago this July, a then very young man rode down Pound Ridge Road past the Bedford Village Green to the airport to leave for a year in Vietnam. Only now, as a parent and a grandparent myself, can I begin to imagine the ache that my late mother and father felt as they drove me down Route 22. For you who are recent, there was no 684. To transport me to, from that then bucolic setting to a place a half a world away, where the names that were to become familiar to me were Hue, the Ashaw Valley, the Angel's Wing, the Parrot's Beak, Phu Loy, and Tay Ninh, a place a half a globe away where there were no guarantees of answered prayers. When I think back to the ride in the opposite direction, on a Sunday evening in the middle of a July thunderstorm, one very long year later, I remember the miraculous transformation that I went through from being a soldier in a muddy base camp in Vietnam to being a civilian in Bedford Village and counting my blessings for answered prayers. Several years ago, a friend and neighbor wrote a column for the Bedford Record Review dealing with a special club whose membership could only be achieved and earned by having been placed in harm's way by the service of our country. And so, this evening, before we begin another high season of summer, I ask that we take a moment to become a little uncomfortable and remember the men and women of this country, fellow members of that special club who have served our country in time of war. Men and women who have left their youth and life on foreign soils, and feel for those parents and loved ones for whom the ache will be permanent, the pain deep, the prayers forever unanswered. We were, during our year in Vietnam, no different from other service people who served in other times and in other places. During our year, we, like they, were alternately fried by the tropical heat, or we shivered as we tried to sleep under the monsoon's torrent, or we trembled with fear. We choked on the dry red dust as we filled countless sandbags, and sometimes, in a lonely spot, we choked on our silent tears. We went without sleep, dry clothes, hot showers. There were many days we would have traded our plane ride home for a can of warm beer or even a pair of dry socks. We were persecuted by mosquitoes and leeches. We suffered from homesickness, fear, and bitter despair. Some achieved the heights of heroic accomplishment. All sacrificed. 58,000 died. And it is for those who have died that we stand here in tribute this evening. Memorial Day is uncomfortable for me as well, as I remember the young men with whom I served in the 82nd Airborne Division who did not have the same good fortune as I to return home in one piece in both mind and body, to live out the rest of their lives as I have been blessed to do, to have those children, those grandchildren. In March of 1997, nearly 30 years after my ride home on that July Sunday evening, and now over 20 years ago, I was in Washington on business and had some free time on a beautiful spring afternoon, and decided the time had finally come to visit the Vietnam Memorial for the first time, but by myself, as I had always intended to do. There's a large book, protected from the elements, on either end of the walkway at the Vietnam Memorial, where you can locate the names of the dead as they appear etched on those ebony tablets. I sought out the names of those I knew who died while we served together in Vietnam, and it was in finding their names together again in chronological order on the tallest of those tall tablets, representing the days, weeks, and months from July of 1968 until July of 1969, that made my heart feel as if it had been pumped too full. It was not until I walked down that sloped walkway and found those tablets bearing the names of the nearly 10,000 young men and women who died in that year that the enormity of it all hit me so firmly in the solar plexus, kicking the breath from me. Until the wars of now, for most of us, especially those of us who live in northern Westchester, we have been spared the heartbreak of the loss of a loved one in armed conflict. But as I saw the names of those I knew and remembered their dates of death again, it was as if it were yesterday when we were all, oh so young and innocent, with that innocent being left in that faraway land by each and every one of us who served there. So the message I leave with you is very simply this: never forget the sacrifices many have made in the service of this country, and be thankful, most of all, for having been blessed to live in this great village, in this great county, in this great state, and while in troubling and challenging times, this greatest country of all time. Thank you.